She had rebuilt herself from nothing, stitch by stitch, day by painful day. And now he was standing right there on the main street of Silver Creek, smiling like he hadn't shattered her into pieces and walked away without looking back. Ethan Mercer had come home. And he hadn't come alone. The woman on his arm wore silk in a town that wore dust. She laughed at something Ethan whispered, and Clara Holloway felt the sound land somewhere behind her ribs, like a blade finding an old scar. Don't you dare fall apart. Not here. Not in front of everyone. But her feet wouldn't move. If this story already has your heart beating faster, stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started like every other morning in Silver Creek. Unremarkable, unhurried, smelling of sawdust and horse manure, and the coffee that old Mabel Pruitt burned black every single day in the diner across from Clara's shop. Clara had been up before the sun, same as always. She'd lit the single lamp above her work table, threaded a needle without squinting, a small private victory she still took satisfaction in, and begun the careful work of hemming the dress that Josephine Aldridge needed for her daughter's engagement supper on Friday. The fabric was pale yellow with small white flowers printed across the bodice. It was delicate work, forgiving work, in a way. The kind that required enough concentration to keep other thoughts from creeping in. She liked it that way. The tailor shop on the corner of 3rd and Main had been her father's before it was hers. Harold Holloway had built the work table himself from pine boards, and Clara had never replaced it despite the warped leg that made it sit slightly uneven. She kept a folded piece of leather beneath that leg, which solved nothing perfectly but solved it well enough. She thought sometimes that was the most honest description of her life she could offer, solved well enough. Harold had died 4 years ago in February, quietly, in his sleep, which was the only quiet thing about the man. He'd been loud and opinionated and deeply fond of arguing about nothing important, and Clara had loved him fiercely without ever quite saying so the way she should have. She said it now sometimes, in the empty shop, when nobody could hear. I love you, Papa. I'm keeping the table. She finished the hem on Josephine's dress by 8 o'clock and hung it carefully near the door. Then she swept the floor, boiled water for tea she barely touched, and began cutting fabric for the Whitmore boys' church suit. Though from what she'd heard about young Thomas Whitmore's recent behavior behind the grain mill, a church suit seemed optimistic. At 9:30, she turned the hand-painted sign in the window from closed to open and stepped outside to shake the dust from the mat. That was when she saw him. Ethan Mercer stood in the street in front of the feed store, and he looked exactly the same. That was the cruelest part. Clara had imagined, in her darker moments over the years, that time would have done something to him, thickened his jaw, stooped his shoulders, put the shadow of consequence behind his eyes. Instead, he stood there straight and brown from the sun, his hat pushed back the way he always wore it, laughing at something the man beside him said. And then the woman stepped down from the wagon. She was perhaps 25, dark-haired, with the kind of polished prettiness that required effort and resources. Her traveling dress was deep burgundy, which was not a practical color for a frontier town, and her boots were city boots that would be ruined by the end of the week. She took Ethan's offered hand as she stepped down, and the gesture was so practiced, so naturally intimate, that Clara understood immediately. Wife. The word dropped through her like a stone through still water. She stood on the boardwalk with the dust mat in her hands and could not move. Around her, Silver Creek went about its business. Wagon wheels grinding on packed dirt, old Walt Carson's dog barking at nothing on the corner, the distant sound of hammering from the new building going up on 4th Street. Normal. All of it perfectly normal. And here was Clara Holloway, rooted to her own front step, watching the man who had not bothered to leave a proper explanation when he ended their engagement, who had sent a letter, a single page of looping apologetic cowardice, delivered by someone else's hand, watching him settle his new wife's wrap around her shoulders, like a man who had figured out how to be tender with someone, just not with her. She became aware of eyes on her. Mabel Pruitt had stopped in the doorway of the diner. Across the street, Harriet Bloom stood very still outside the dry goods store, watching Clara the way people watch a man standing at the edge of something steep. They all remembered. That was the thing about small towns. They remembered everything, held it all in their collective memory like a locked chest, and brought it back out at exactly the wrong moment. Don't you dare, Clara told herself again. You have stood in that shop alone every day for 3 years. You have sewn 10,000 stitches, and kept this business, and kept yourself, and you have not fallen apart once. You are not going to fall apart now because Ethan Mercer decided to come back to Silver Creek with a woman in silk. Her hands tightened on the dust mat. Ethan turned. Of course he turned. Because the universe, Clara had decided long ago, did not operate with any particular concern for mercy or timing. He turned, and his eyes found her immediately, the way a man's eyes will always find the specific face he's been half expecting and half dreading. She watched something move across his expression. Surprise, yes, but not as much as there should have been, like he'd known she'd still be here, like he'd counted on it. He raised 2 fingers to his hat brim. The old greeting, their greeting, the small private signal that used to mean I see you, and I'll come to you soon, and a dozen other things that words hadn't needed to carry. Clara felt something go hot and tight in her chest. And then a voice came from directly beside her, low, unhurried, utterly calm, and said, "Morning, Clara." But she had not heard anyone approach. That was the first thing that struck her later, turning it over in her mind. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't sensed anyone close. He was simply there, suddenly, standing 1 step behind her left shoulder like he had every right to be. She turned. How was tall? She registered that first because it was unavoidable, wide through the shoulders in the way that comes from real work rather than intention. His face was angular and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone in a practical mood, not a generous one. Dark eyes set beneath a straight brow. He wore working clothes, nothing notable, worn canvas trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow, scuffed boots that had seen serious mileage. His hat was plain brown felt, pushed back the same half-inch that Ethan wore his, though somehow on this man the gesture looked entirely different, less charming, more like he just needed to see clearly. Clara had seen him before, she realized. The horse training operation out at the Miller property east of town. She'd had no reason to speak to him. She had no idea what he was doing standing beside her now. "I don't," she started. "I brought your father's coat," he said, without looking at her, his eyes tracking across the street in a way that was entirely deliberate. "The one you sent for mending. Dropped it off early. Figured you were already open." He had not brought any coat. There was no coat. Clara stared at his profile for a fraction of a second, the easy set of his jaw, the absolute stillness in his face, and understood that this man was telling a lie so smoothly it barely qualified as one. That he had seen what she was standing in the middle of and had chosen, for reasons that were entirely his own, to walk into it beside her. She turned back toward the street. Ethan was still watching them. The woman on his arm, his wife, had followed his gaze and was now studying Clara with that particular careful attention that women give each other when taking measure. "Thank you," Clara said, to the man beside her. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to be. "I wasn't sure it would be ready. Took it in a bit through the shoulders like you asked," he said. "Fits better now." Ethan said something to his wife. She smiled at something in his expression. Then they turned and walked down the street together, the woman's city boots clicking on the boards, and Clara watched them go until she was certain she was watching their backs and not their faces. She exhaled. Slowly, deliberately, she shook out the dust mat. Once, twice. Set it back in front of the door, turned around. The man was still there. "I don't know your name," she said. "Ryder Kane." He wasn't looking at her with pity, which was the first thing she checked for and didn't find. He looked at her with the same straightforward attention he'd given the street. "I work out at Miller's." "I know." "I didn't plan to do that," he said. I saw you standing there, and—" He stopped, set his jaw slightly. "I don't know. Seemed like you needed someone to stand next to you." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I had it handled," she said. "You did," he agreed easily. "Didn't need me." "Understood." He pulled his hat down a fraction, the barest nod, and turned to go. "Ryder." He stopped. She wasn't sure afterward why she said the next thing. Months later she would think about that moment, the specific quality of the morning light, the smell of Mabel's burned coffee drifting across the street, the small, precise courage it required to say what she said, and she still wouldn't be able to explain it fully, only that something in her had been scraped down to something honest. "Thank you," she said, "for the coat." He glanced back. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "Get it back to me when you're done," he said, and walked away. Silver Creek had not changed much since the day Ethan Mercer left, and yet it had changed completely, the way places do when you stop seeing them through someone else's eyes and start seeing them through your own. It was a working town, not a prosperous one exactly, but a functioning one, which was perhaps a more honest ambition. The main street ran north to south, flanked on both sides by the usual necessities: the feed store, the dry goods, Mabel's diner, the blacksmith shop, the small assay office that stayed busy during good months and empty during bad ones. There was a church at the north end with a crooked steeple that had been crooked for as long as Clara could remember, and a saloon at the south end that more than compensated. 340-some-odd people, give or take, whoever had come in from the outlying ranches on any given week. Clara knew most of them by name and knew their measurements by heart, which sometimes felt like the most intimate knowledge a person could hold. She knew that August Reyes had put on 7 pounds in his midsection since last winter. She knew that young Della Marsh, who insisted on ordering her dresses a size smaller than fitted, was quietly, stubbornly hopeful about something. She knew things about people that they'd never thought to tell her, written in the fabric they brought her, and the alterations they asked for, and the things they said while she was pinning their hems and their guard was down. She had built a life inside this knowing. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 22, standing on the edge of a future that had included Ethan Mercer and a farm east of town and children she'd already half-named in her private thoughts. That future was gone, had been gone for 3 years. And if Clara was honest, truly honest, in the way she almost never allowed herself to be, she wasn't certain that future had ever been as solid as she'd believed it to be. She'd built it partly from real material and partly from hope. And hope without foundation is just air-dressed-up fancy. But the loss of it had been real. The morning she'd opened the letter, her hand steady, because nothing in her had understood yet what was happening, and read Ethan's careful, apologetic sentences about needing something she couldn't give him, and not being fair to her, and hoping she'd find the happiness she deserved. The way the words had been spaced out on the page, generous margins, like he'd taken care with the formatting, like he'd revised it. The particular cruelty of that detail, revised it, made sure it read well, had sat with her for a long time. She'd folded the letter and put it in the stove and stood there watching it burn. Then she'd opened the shop. The town had been kind, mostly. Kindness in small towns often has its shadow side, the sympathy that shades into pity, the pity that shades into a kind of possessive interest in your wound, like it belongs to the community now. And Clara had felt all of that. But she'd also felt real warmth. Harriet Bloom had appeared at the shop 3 days after the letter with a jar of preserved plums and no explanation. Old Walt Carson had started clearing the snow from her front step in winter without ever being asked. Mabel burned her coffee for everyone equally, but always saved the first cup of the day for Clara. She had not been alone. She had not been loved the way she'd expected to be loved, but she had not been alone. And now Ethan Mercer was back. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bed above the shop and listened to the town settle into its nighttime sounds. The distant music from the saloon, the occasional horse, the wind working at the corner of the building, and tried to be reasonable about what she was feeling. It was allowed to come back. Silver Creek was his hometown too. His family's property was still 2 miles east of town, though she'd heard it had been leased out since his parents passed. He had every legal and reasonable right to return. The woman, his wife, had done nothing to Clara, had looked at her across the street with something Clara supposed was curiosity, maybe wariness, but nothing cruel. None of this was unreasonable. People moved on. She had moved on. You froze on your own front step, said the uncharitable part of her mind. You couldn't move. Three years of getting yourself together, and you froze. That was true. She had to sit with that. What was less clear was Ryder Kane, and why she kept returning to the specific moment he'd appeared beside her. The solidness of it. The complete absence of drama in what he'd done. No performance, no grand gesture, just, I see that you're in a difficult position. Here, I'll stand next to you. And then the perfectly maintained fiction of the coat, delivered so flatly and with such confidence that even she had half believed it for a moment. She didn't know him. Had seen him perhaps a dozen times without actually seeing him, the way you do with anyone who moves at the edge of your daily life, without ever entering the center of it. He'd been working at Miller's place for 6 months? Longer? She'd heard he was good with difficult horses. She'd heard he kept to himself, which in Silver Creek was the kind of thing that got noticed and occasionally talked about. She hadn't cared particularly either way. Now she turned his face over in her mind the way you turn a stone to look at the underside, not expecting anything, just looking. Seemed like you needed someone to stand next to you. She had needed that. She hadn't known it until it happened, but she had. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, and eventually managed something close to it, though her dreams were fractured and left her nothing in the morning except the residue of unease. The next morning, Ethan came into the shop. She was sorting thread, a mindless task she'd invented to keep her hands busy, when the bell above the door rang and she looked up and there he was, hat in his hand, looking around the shop with an expression she could not immediately identify. "Clara," he said. "Ethan." She set down the thread, made herself meet his eyes. "What can I do for you?" It wasn't a question. She'd removed the question mark deliberately. He noticed. I wanted to." He stopped, ran a hand over the back of his neck, the gesture so achingly familiar that she had to look away for a moment, past his shoulder at the window. "I heard you're still running the shop. Thought I'd come by." "I've been running the shop," she agreed. "Is there something you need made, altered?" "No, He stepped further in, and she had to fight the urge to step back to create distance. She held her ground. "Clara, I know this must be. I imagine seeing me was a surprise." "It was unexpected," she said. "You didn't write ahead." The words came out flat and neat, and she watched them land. Something shifted in his face. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." "Is your wife settling in all right? I imagine Silver Creek is different from what she's used to." "Her name is Margaret." He said it with a slight emphasis, like he was trying to make Margaret real, make her present in the room. Yes, she's settling. She's adaptable." "That's a good quality." Silence. The shop smelled of beeswax and fabric, and the faint metallic edge of the scissors she kept on the work table. Ethan looked around again, at the shelves of fabric bolts, the dress forms, the organized, careful arrangement of everything. "You've kept it up," he said. There was something in his voice, warmth maybe, or the performance of warmth, and she could no longer tell which. "And it's my shop," she said. He looked at her then, directly, with what she recognized as the particular expression he used when he was trying to communicate something he didn't quite have the words for. She'd spent 2 years of her life learning to read that expression, filling in the gaps for him, translating his silences into meaning. She didn't translate anything now. "It was good to see you, Clara," he said finally. "I mean that. Enjoy your time in town," she said. He put his hat back on, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "That man," he said, without turning, "yesterday, standing with you." She waited. "Is he? Are you?" "Goodbye, Ethan," she said. He left. Clara stood very still in the middle of her shop and breathed until the tightness in her chest released enough to function. Then she picked up the thread she'd put down and continued sorting it, her hands perfectly steady, her eyes burning in a way she refused to give in to. She saw Ryder that afternoon, by accident. She'd closed the shop at 4 and walked to the edge of town on the East Road, which she sometimes did when she needed air that wasn't Main Street air. It had a different quality out there, less watched. The Miller property was visible half a mile further, the fencing and the low outbuildings and the training ring where Miller's operation ran. Ryder was in the ring with a gray horse. She stopped at the fence without planning to. The horse was young. She could see that even from this distance, and jumpy in the way young horses are, all nervous energy looking for a direction. Most men she'd seen work difficult horses matched their energy, got louder and more forceful when the animal got more resistant. Ryder didn't. He stood still. When the horse shied away from him, he didn't follow. He just stood there, waiting, like he had all the time there was. The horse circled the ring, came back. Ryder didn't move. The horse put its nose out, then closer. Then Ryder lifted one hand slowly and laid it against the horse's neck, and the animal stood there and let him. Clara was not sure how long she watched. Long enough that the light shifted from afternoon to early evening gold. Long enough that Ryder eventually looked up and saw her at the fence, and she felt her face do something she didn't intend, some involuntary acknowledgement. He walked over. The horse followed him a few steps, then lost interest and wandered. "Evening," he said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." He rested his arms on the fence rail, looking out at the ring, Close up, the work was visible. The fine dust on his shirt, the marks of sweat at his collar, a small cut along his forearm that was dried and old. How'd the day go? Again, not quite a question. Ethan came into the shop this morning, she said. She had not planned to say that. Ryder didn't react with any obvious expression. He just nodded slightly, like she'd confirmed a weather report. What did he want? He asked. I don't know. To be seen, maybe. To see how I was. She paused. To feel like what happened between us still meant something to him, now that he can afford to let it mean something from a safe distance. Ryder considered that. Yeah, he said finally. Some people need that. I know. She looked at the gray horse, who had gone back to the far side of the ring and was standing there looking at nothing with the magnificent vacant dignity that horses managed. It doesn't mean he gets it. No, Ryder agreed. It doesn't. Another silence, but it was a different kind from the one in the shop with Ethan. That silence had been charged with everything neither of them would say. This silence was simply the end of a thought, resting before the next one. Yesterday, Clara said. What you didn't have to. I know. You don't know me. I know enough, he said. He glanced at her sideways. I know Harold Holloway was your father, and he built half the fencing on 3 different properties around here. I know you've run that shop alone for 3 years, and people say you're the best seamstress in the county, which from what I can tell around here means you're probably the best in the territory. I know Ethan Mercer left you 3 days before your wedding, and I know the whole town watched you put yourself back together afterward. He looked back at the ring. That's a reasonable amount to know about someone. Clara was quiet for a moment. And what did you think, she said, when you saw me standing there this morning? He took a moment. She had the sense he was choosing actual words, not performing the choosing. I thought you looked like someone who was about to have to be brave in front of people who were watching to see if they needed to feel sorry for you, he said. And I thought that was a terrible position to be in. She looked at him. His profile was toward her, jaw set, eyes on the ring. So you lied, she said. I told a story, he said. There's a code in it eventually, if you need one. She laughed. It surprised her, came out fast and genuine, a short exhale of actual amusement. She pressed her lips together after it, somewhat self-conscious. Ryder glanced at her with that almost smile again. I should get back, he said. Got one more to work before dark. Ryder. She said his name without having planned to. Would you, if it isn't any trouble, would you walk through town with me tomorrow morning? Not early, around 9, 10 maybe, when people are out. He looked at her. Ethan, she said. Not as an explanation exactly, more as an acknowledgement of what they both understood. He's going to be in town for a while. I don't know how long. And the way people look at me. She stopped, reorganized. I'm not asking you to lie any more than you already have. I just thought, if people saw us together, it might... Clara, he said. She waited. I'll be at your door at 9:30, he said. What? I was there at 9:20. She'd been watching from the window. Not for him, she told herself, just watching the street in general. And she saw him come around the corner from the direction of the Miller property, unhurried, in a clean shirt that still looked like a working man's shirt, but had been obviously considered. He stopped at her door and knocked, 2 knocks, and waited. She counted to 5 before opening it. Morning, he said. Good morning. She stepped out and pulled the door behind her. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of June morning that reminded you there was still beauty in things before the full heat came in. You didn't have to be early. I wasn't early, he said. I was exactly on time. It's 9:20. For me, that's on time. They walked. The thing about walking through Silver Creek with Ryder Kane, Clara discovered almost immediately, was that he did it without apology. He didn't hunch or shuffle or make himself smaller to avoid attention. He walked the way he stood, like the space he occupied was his, not borrowed. He nodded at people they passed with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't performing friendliness either. Just, I see you, you exist, moving on. Clara, who had spent 3 years navigating the sympathetic attention of this town by making herself as unremarkable as possible, found herself walking differently next to him. Her shoulders went back. Not deliberately. It just happened, the way your posture adjusts to whoever you're walking with. Walt, Ryder said, as old Walt Carson and his perpetually outraged dog came toward them. Morning, Ryder, Miss Clara. Walt's eyes moved between them with an interest he didn't even try to suppress. Fine day. It is, Clara said. They passed. Clara heard Walt's footsteps slow behind them and resisted turning around. Harriet Bloom was outside the dry goods, and she did what Harriet always did, which was become very busy with some small task that happened to face the street. Harriet, Clara called. Harriet looked up with a smile that was about 40% genuine warmth and 60% burning curiosity. Clara, and Mr. Kane, isn't it? Are you two? Just taking the morning air, Ryder said. How's your husband's back, Mrs. Bloom? Harriet blinked at the subject change, then remembered to answer. Better, actually, since he stopped loading the flour sacks himself. They moved on. How do you know about her husband's back? Clara asked when they were past. I loaded some of his flour sacks last week, Ryder said. He mentioned it. You just help people, randomly. The flour was heavy. He said it like that was an entirely sufficient explanation. They turned the corner onto Main Street, and Clara saw Ethan before Ethan saw them. I was standing outside the feed store with his wife, Margaret, and two other men she didn't recognize, all of them deep in some conversation. Margaret was holding a wrapped package and looking at something down the street, and she was the one who saw Clara first. Something moved in her expression. Awareness, the kind that meant she'd been told about Clara, had formed some picture of her in her mind, and was now adjusting it. Then Ethan looked up. Clara was aware of Ryder's arm at the edge of her vision, slightly ahead of her, shoulders straight, pace unchanged. She matched his pace. She kept her eyes on a point slightly past Ethan's left shoulder. Clara, Ethan said. Ethan. Margaret. She said the name deliberately, clearly. I know your name. I am not afraid of your name. Morning. Morning. Margaret's voice was pleasant and careful. She had good eyes, Clara noted, observant, intelligent, not hostile, curious. She was looking at Ryder the way someone looks at a variable they haven't fully calculated yet. Ryder, Ethan said. His voice had a flatness in it that hadn't been there in her shop yesterday. Mercer. Ryder's reply was a single word and somehow managed to be neither warm nor rude. Just, I know who you are. We're moving on. They moved on. Clara waited until they turned off Main Street before she exhaled fully. That was, she started. Handled, Ryder said. You knew his name. Everyone knows everyone around here. He looked at you like, she stopped herself. Like he didn't like what he saw, Ryder said. Yeah, I noticed. She looked at him sideways. He was looking ahead, that same settled expression on his face. She was starting to read it a little. Not well, but slightly. The set of his jaw that meant he'd noticed more than he was saying. The way his eyes moved without appearing to move when he was taking in a space. Does it bother you? She asked. Him not liking me? Yes. No, he said simply. Most people would. I'm not most people, he said. Not arrogantly, just accurately. They walked back toward the shop in a silence that had become, over the course of the morning, less like absence and more like presence, like a third thing walking with them. At her door, he stopped. Same time Thursday? He said. She looked at him. In the morning light, his eyes were darker than she'd realized, and there was something there she couldn't name yet. Not the almost smile, something quieter, something that she recognized the shape of without knowing its content. Thursday, she said. What? He came back Wednesday. Not to walk. He appeared at the back of the shop in the late afternoon with a length of new rope and fixed the pulley system on the storage loft that Harold had jury-rigged years ago, and Clara had been meaning to have properly repaired for 2 years. He didn't ask permission. He arrived, assessed the problem, disappeared to get what he needed, and fixed it. You didn't have to do that, she said, coming up the back steps to find him testing the repaired pulley. It was going to drop something on someone eventually, he said. That's still, I know. He climbed down from the loft, brushed the dust from his hands. Is there anything else around here that's about to fail? She looked around, somewhat helplessly. The hinge on the front door has been stiff for months. I'll bring oil next time. You don't, Clara. He said her name with a particular patience, the same patience she'd watched him use with the gray horse. Not condescending, just steady. I'm here. There are things that need doing. I'll do them. She looked at him for a moment. Why? She asked. He picked up his hat from the workbench, considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. Because it's useful, he said, and because I like being here. He said the last part without looking at her. She noticed that. She noticed it. Thursday, she said. He put his hat on. Thursday, he confirmed and went out the back. By the end of the second week, Silver Creek had made up its mind. Clara could read it in the way people looked at them on their morning walks. The satisfaction in it, the warmth that communities feel when two of their own find their way toward each other. The story people told themselves was simple and pleasing. Clara Holloway, who had been quietly sad for 3 years, had found someone. And wasn't it something that had happened just when that Mercer man came back, as if the timing itself was making a point? Harriet Bloom stopped merely watching and started making small celebrations of it. A jar of honey left on Clara's step, a wave of particular approval when they passed. Mabel Pruitt gave Ryder coffee at her diner with a speed and generosity she reserved for people she'd decided to approve of. The story had legs. It had the shape of something people wanted to be true. Clara told herself she was managing a situation, that Ryder understood it was a situation, that they were both clear-eyed about what it was. But on Thursday morning, when he appeared at her door at 9:19 and said nothing except, "Ready?" and she stepped out and they fell into step together, there was a moment, just a moment, lasting approximately 3 of her heartbeats, when she stopped thinking about Ethan entirely. She was just walking, in the morning, beside someone she was beginning to like very much, and it scared her more than anything else had. Ethan found her alone on Friday. She'd been in the supply room taking inventory when she heard the bell, and when she came out, he was standing by the work table, looking at the half-finished Whitmore suit spread across it with an expression she couldn't read. "Your man's not with you today," he said. "He's not my—" She stopped, corrected herself silently. "He is, for all intents Ethan needs to understand. He's working." Ethan turned to face her. 3 years had not changed his face, and yet something had changed inside it. There was a quality around his eyes that was new, or maybe she'd always been too close to see it, and only distance had sharpened her vision, a kind of restless dissatisfaction. Like something in him was always comparing the present to some ideal he carried and finding it slightly wanting. "You seem happy," he said. "I am," she said, and was surprised, saying it, to find that it was partially, imprecisely, true. "That's good." His voice was careful. "I'm glad for you." "Thank you." "Clara, don't," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Whatever you're about to say," she said. "Don't. It's 3 years too late. Your wife is somewhere in this town waiting for you, and my Ryder is coming by later, and we have nothing left that needs saying between us." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Perform," he said. "For me. I get it. You've moved on. I understand." Something hot and clean moved through her. "I'm not performing," she said. "I am standing in my shop, where I have stood every day for 3 years without your help, and I am telling you that I've built something here that you don't get to walk into and comment on. What I have with Ryder," the name felt different in her mouth, heavier somehow, more real, "is not for your benefit or your understanding." Ethan stared at her. "You should go," she said. He went. Clara stood in the silence of the shop for a long moment. Then she went back to the supply room and continued her inventory, because that was what there was to do, and doing it felt like the truest thing she could offer herself. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were burning again, the same way they had been the first morning. But this time, she thought, the burning felt different, less like grief, more like something waking up after a long cold winter, which hurt in its own way but was not the same as hurt. It was not the same at all. So bad. The arrangement had no official terms. There was no conversation where they sat down and mapped it out. No handshake, no agreed-upon end date. It simply continued the way water finds the path of least resistance, not by force, but by the natural logic of the land it moves through. Ryder came by Thursday morning, then the following Monday, then Wednesday, then Thursday again, and by the third week the rhythm had established itself without either of them naming it. Most mornings, 9:30, her door. They would walk. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. He brought the oil for the front door hinge on a Tuesday and fixed it in 4 minutes while she held the lamp, and then he stayed for coffee that she made badly, and he drank without complaint. She noticed he never complained about anything she offered him. Not the coffee, not the irregular hours, not the fact that their arrangement existed in the gray space between fiction and something she hadn't let herself name yet. He simply showed up and did what was in front of him to do, with the same steady patience she'd watched him give that gray horse in the training ring. The gray horse, she'd learned, was named Duchess, which Ryder had said with a completely straight face, as though the name was not absurd for an animal who had spent 3 weeks trying to bite him. She picked it, he'd said when Clara laughed. I just confirmed it. Horses don't pick their names. Duchess does, he said, and the firmness of it closed the subject in a way that made her laugh again. She was laughing more. She noticed that too. Silver Creek noticed everything. That was simply the nature of the place. 340 people living close together meant that the social ecosystem was finely tuned, every variation registered and processed with the collective efficiency of a very small, very attentive government. Clara had always known this, had in fact relied on it in the planning of the arrangement. People would see, people would talk, the story would spread. Ethan would hear it and know that Clara Holloway had not been waiting. What she hadn't calculated was how quickly the town would stop treating it as interesting news and start treating it as settled fact. Within 2 weeks, there was no "are they together?" There was simply the assumption that they were, delivered with the comfortable certainty that communities feel when they believe they've recognized something true. Harriet Bloom mentioned Ryder in the same breath as Clara with the ease of long habit. Mabel Pruitt asked Clara one morning, entirely without preamble, whether Ryder preferred apple pie or peach, because she was planning the Sunday desserts and wanted to know. Clara had stood there for a moment, genuinely uncertain of the answer. Peach, she said, guessing, and later asked him. Peach, he confirmed, and looked at her with the sideways, almost smile. Why? Mabel Pruitt is planning her Sunday menu around you. He was quiet for a second. That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a while, he said, and she couldn't tell if he was joking. What she could tell, what became clearer each day, the way things become clearer when you stop trying to look directly at them and let them come into focus on their own, was that Ryder Kane was not a simple man. He presented simply. He spoke directly, moved without excess, spent no apparent energy on impression. But under that economy of presentation was a person of considerable interior complexity, and she was beginning to find the edges of it. He read. She discovered this when she saw him returning a book to the small lending shelf at the dry goods store, a battered volume of frontier surveying she would not have expected, but then next to it, a novel she recognized, one she had read herself twice. He caught her looking at the novel and said nothing, just set the surveying book back and picked up something else, and she filed it away. He had opinions about things he rarely volunteered. She learned them accidentally. A comment about the way someone had built a fence wrong would turn into 3 sentences of surprisingly technical detail, then stop abruptly, like he'd remembered he was talking. She started asking follow-up questions specifically to extend these moments. He was undeceived by the tactic, but answered anyway. He had been somewhere else before Silver Creek. Several somewhere elses. She gathered this in fragments, a passing reference to winter in a place where the snow came differently, a comment about horses that implied different country than this. She didn't push. He didn't offer. The past was present in him the way old injuries are present in a person's walk, visible to anyone who knew what to look for, but not his primary way of moving. She thought about that, about the things people carry that they don't explain. She thought about it more than was probably wise. What she was not thinking about, what she was disciplining herself fairly successfully not to think about, was what would happen when Ethan left. The arrangement existed because of Ethan. When Ethan's business in Silver Creek concluded, when he and Margaret climbed into a wagon and headed back to wherever their life was, the reason for the arrangement would dissolve. Ryder would go back to his work at Miller's. She would go back to her mornings alone. The town would note the change with the same attentive interest it had noted everything else, and there would be talk for a week or two, and then it would fade, and she would be exactly where she had been. She told herself this was fine, that she had agreed to exactly this and understood it clearly. She did not examine the specific feeling that accompanied the telling too closely. Ethan, meanwhile, was not behaving like a man preparing to leave. He had business to settle with the family property, that much she understood. There were legal matters related to his parents' estate that had apparently been left unfinished, and the lawyer handling them worked out of Silver Creek once a week and moved with the decisiveness of a man who enjoyed billable hours. But beyond the legal matters, Ethan seemed to be in no hurry. He and Margaret had taken a room at the hotel on 2nd Street. Margaret had introduced herself around town with a careful, measured pleasantness, and Clara, to her complicated feelings on the matter, found that she didn't dislike her. Margaret was not the woman Clara might have assembled from resentment, not shallow or cruel or obviously wrong for him. She was composed and somewhat reserved and had the air of a person managing a situation that was more complicated than she'd been told it would be. Clara felt, on 2 separate occasions, the uncomfortable stirring of something like sympathy for Margaret Mercer. It was an unwelcome feeling, and she set it aside. What was not possible to set aside was Ethan's behavior, which had settled into a pattern that Clara recognized and distrusted. He was present, deliberately, consistently present, in the places she went, at the edges of her daily routine, in the street when she walked with Ryder. He didn't approach her again after the confrontation in the shop. He was too intelligent for that, or perhaps too careful. But he arranged himself into her peripheral vision with a regularity that couldn't be accidental, and she watched him watching Ryder the way you watch someone work out a calculation they keep getting wrong. She mentioned it to Ryder on a Wednesday morning, walking back from the east end of town. "He's watching you," she said. "I know. It bothers him, seeing you with me." "I know that too." Ryder was quiet for a step or two. "What does it do to you, seeing him watch?" She considered the question honestly. "It makes me tired," she said finally. "I thought seeing him would feel like, I don't know, something bigger, more terrible. But mostly it just makes me tired, like having to carry something I thought I'd already put down." Ryder nodded. He understood, she thought, the particular exhaustion of things you'd done the work of getting past, and then had to encounter again unexpectedly. "The thing is," she said, and then stopped. "What?" "He looks at you like you took something from him." She paused. "Which is, he left. He chose to leave. Whatever I am to him now, whatever he feels seeing me with someone else, he doesn't have the right to feel it. You can't forfeit something and then stand there watching the new owner and feel wronged." Ryder was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level and careful. "People don't generally ask permission for what they feel," he said. "He can feel whatever he feels. Doesn't mean it costs you anything." She looked at him. "That's very measured of you." "I'm a measured person." "About most things," she agreed. "Not about horses." The corner of his mouth moved. "Horses are different." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because horses don't pretend," he said. "They're exactly what they are. A scared horse is scared. A trusting horse trusts you. There's no performance. No story they're telling themselves about what they should be feeling." Clara walked beside him and let that sit. "Are you saying I'm pretending?" she asked. "I'm saying most people do," he said. "Including me. That's not a criticism." She thought about that for the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, at her work table, stitching the lining of a vest for August Reyes, who had, as she'd noted months ago, continued to expand gently through the midsection and required adjustment. She thought about pretending, about the story she was telling herself about this arrangement and why she was comfortable with it and what would happen when it ended. At some point, the needle went through the fabric and she made a stitch, and it wasn't straight and she had to take it out and do it again. She couldn't remember the last time she'd made a crooked stitch. She held the vest up to the light and looked at the damage, which was minimal and entirely fixable. "Stop it," she said to herself in the empty shop. She fixed the stitch. She finished the vest. She closed the shop at 5 and went upstairs and made herself a supper that she ate entirely without tasting, which was how she knew she was in trouble. The trouble arrived more concretely the following Saturday. It was the afternoon of the Morrison wedding. Not a grand affair, but a popular one, because the whole town liked Jessie Morrison and her new husband Tom Garrett, and the reception in the square behind the church drew essentially everyone in Silver Creek who could walk there. Clara went because Jessie had asked her specifically, and because she had made the wedding dress, and because refusing would have required an explanation she didn't have. Ryder appeared at her side approximately 4 minutes after she arrived, which either meant he had been watching for her or had extraordinary timing. She suspected the former. She didn't ask. They stood together at the edge of the gathering, which was how they usually stood, not in the center of things, not performing their way through the crowd, but present, observing, occasionally pulled into conversations by the gravitational pull of anyone who wanted to congratulate them or ask pointed questions about their intentions dressed up as casual conversation. "You look nice," Ryder said, at some point, entirely without preamble. Clara had been watching Jesse dance badly and joyfully with Tom Garrett and feeling a complicated warmth about it. She turned to look at Ryder. He was looking at the dancers, not at her, his expression perfectly neutral. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it. The blue." He still wasn't looking at her. "It suits you." She looked down at the dress. A deep slate blue she'd made herself last spring. Nothing special, just good fabric well cut. She looked back at Ryder. "You're not looking at me," she said. "I looked before." A pause. "When you arrived." She felt something move in her that she'd been carefully not feeling for 2 weeks. She looked away. Found Ethan across the square without meaning to, standing with Margaret, watching her with an expression that had gone flat and controlled. He sees it, she thought. Whatever just happened, whatever that was, he saw it. And underneath that quieter, something just happened. She spent the next hour telling herself it hadn't. She talked to Harriet Bloom about the dress, and talked to old Walt about his dog's ongoing campaign against a particular fence post, and talked to Mabel about peach pie, and kept herself busy and moving and present in the actual conversation in front of her rather than the one going on inside her chest. At one point she looked up, and Ryder was talking to Tom Garrett, the new groom, both of them with cups of something in their hands, and Tom was laughing at something Ryder said. Ryder was not quite smiling, but there was a quality in his face she hadn't seen before. Something eased, briefly opened. He looked younger. He looked like someone who was, for this specific moment, not carrying whatever it was he carried. She watched him for longer than was reasonable. She stopped watching when she realized Harriet Bloom was watching her watch him. That night, in the narrow bed above the shop, she lay awake longer than usual and did the honest accounting she'd been avoiding. She liked Ryder Kane, not as a useful fiction, not as a kind man who had done her a favor. She liked him the way you like someone when you've started listening for the specific quality of their footsteps on your front step. When you notice that the coffee tastes better when there's someone to drink it with. When a horse's ridiculous name makes you laugh harder than it should because it came from him. She liked him, and she had no idea what he felt. And the arrangement they were in made the question almost impossible to ask. Because what if he was still just being useful? What if his natural decency, the same decency that made him load flour sacks for people he barely knew, and fix pulleys without being asked, and stand beside strangers on boardwalks, what if that decency was the whole of it, and she was reading into his steadiness something that existed only in the story she was telling herself? She had built a story before. She knew how convincing they could be from the inside. She turned onto her side and looked at the wall and breathed slowly. The shop below her was quiet. The town was quiet. Somewhere outside, something moved in the dark, and she lay there waiting for sleep that was slow to come, while the arrangement she'd created to protect herself from one kind of pain quietly, methodically arranged itself into another. She did not sleep well. But somewhere around midnight, beneath all the uncertainty, something was present that she recognized without quite being ready to call it by its name. Something that was not performance, not fiction, not a story she'd chosen for its usefulness. Just true. Stubbornly, dangerously, irrevocably true. The week after the Morrison wedding, something shifted in the quality of Ethan's presence in Silver Creek. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you feel before you can name it, the way the air changes before rain. He stopped positioning himself at the edges of Clara's routine. He stopped the careful, deliberate appearances. Instead, he went still. And stillness in Ethan Mercer, Clara had learned years ago, was never absence. It was accumulation. She noticed it and said nothing to Ryder. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because naming it would require explaining why she was still paying such close attention to Ethan's moods, and that explanation would lead somewhere she wasn't ready to go. Ryder noticed it too. She could tell by the way his eyes moved differently on their morning walks, a slight additional attention, the way an animal's ears adjust before the rest of the body follows. He didn't say anything either. They had developed over the weeks a shared language of silence that communicated more than it should have for two people who had agreed to nothing permanent. What neither of them saw coming was the lumber crew. The McKinley timber operation had been working the eastern slopes for 3 months, rotating crews through Silver Creek every few weeks. Rough men doing rough work, spending their off days in town with the specific energy of people who had been living in close quarters in difficult conditions and needed somewhere to put it. Most of them were harmless enough in the ordinary sense. They drank, they were loud, they paid for what they consumed, and they moved on. The current crew had been in town 10 days, which was apparently long enough for certain observations to accumulate. Clara heard the first piece of it from Mabel, who heard everything. "Some of those McKinley boys have been talking about your rider," Mabel said, on a Thursday morning, refilling Clara's coffee with the particular energy she had when delivering information she'd been sitting on. "Saying things." "What kind of things?" "The kind men say when they don't like that someone has something they want." Mabel set the pot down. "Ray Decker's been running his mouth the most. Big man, red beard, you've seen him." Clara had seen him. Hard not to. Decker was the kind of large that occupied space aggressively, and he'd looked at Clara twice in the street in a way she'd filed under unpleasant but ignorable. About Ryder specifically. About Ryder being an outsider who came from nowhere and has no business being where he is. Mabel's voice was dry and precise. "Meaning with you. Meaning in this town's good graces. You know how that goes?" She did. It was an old story. Stranger earns. What local men feel entitled to, local men decide the problem is the stranger rather than their own entitlement. The logic was circular and stupid and occasionally dangerous. "Has Ryder heard any of this?" she asked. "I expect so," Mabel said. "Hard to miss Ray Decker when he's talking." Clara carried that home and set it down in the back of her mind and tried to leave it there. She told herself it was talk. And talk in Silver Creek usually stayed talk. She told herself Ryder was a grown man who had navigated difficult situations long before he came here and would navigate this one without her managing it for him. She told herself a lot of reasonable things, and they worked tolerably well until Friday evening when she heard it happening outside her back door. She'd been closing up the shop, the last lamp turned down, the work table cleared, when the voices came through the alley. She recognized Decker's voice first, the particular volume of a man who drank to get louder. There were at least two others. And then Ryder's voice, lower, even, one short response she couldn't make out. She went to the back door. Through the gap she could see the alley behind the shop in the failing light. 3 men from the lumber crew had Ryder partially backed against the opposite wall, not touching him yet, but arranged in the specific geometry of men who intended to. Decker was in front, a head taller than the other two, rolling his shoulders in a way that was preparatory and obvious. Ryder stood with his back not quite against the wall, his hands loose at his sides, his face carrying the exact same expression it carried when he worked with difficult horses. Watchful. Unhurried. Not performing calm. Actually calm, which was different and more unsettling to the men opposite him, she could tell. "You think you're something special," Decker was saying. "Coming in here, setting yourself up with her like you earned it. You didn't earn a damn thing." "All right," Ryder said. "All right?" Decker laughed, and the laugh had an ugly edge. "That's all you've got. What do you want me to say?" "I want you to stop acting like you belong here." "I work here," Ryder said. "That's generally what belonging means." One of the other men, younger, with the amped-up energy of someone trying to impress the larger man, stepped forward. "Decker says you've been putting on airs, walking around with the Holloway woman like you're somebody." Ryder looked at him with a patience that was almost pedagogical. "I walk through town with Clara in the mornings," he said. "That's what I do. I'm not sure what airs look like, but I don't think that's them." "You're a nobody," Decker said. "Horse trainer, drifter. She doesn't know what you are." "Maybe not," Ryder said. "That's between her and me." Decker moved first. Not a swing, a shove, both hands against Ryder's chest, hard, intended to start something that Decker could then call a response to. Clara's hand went to the door latch. Ryder didn't stumble. He stepped back with the shove, redistributed, and came back to standing without having lost his feet. He didn't swing. He didn't grab. He moved his body sideways when the second man came at him and let the momentum carry the man past him into the wall. Not a throw exactly, more like a redirect. And then stepped back again. He kept stepping back. Clara watched him get hit twice, once in the shoulder, once across the jaw from Decker's fist, and neither time did he swing. He absorbed it, moved away from it, used his feet instead of his hands. Decker was increasingly furious at the failure of the situation to escalate the way he'd planned. Ryder's refusal to fight back, real fighting back, the kind Decker wanted, was making the whole thing look different than it was supposed to look. "Hit me back," Decker said with an actual note of frustration. "No," Ryder said. "You're a coward." "Maybe. Not defensive, not ashamed. Just the word, flat and easy, offering Decker nothing to build on." Clara pushed the door open. Ray Decker, she said. All four men looked at her. She was standing in the back doorway of her shop in her work apron, with her arms crossed, and she looked, she hoped, considerably more composed than she felt. Her heart was going fast and her jaw was tight, and she was aware of the specific cold quality of controlled anger. Miss Holloway, Decker said. Something in his expression shifted. Not shame exactly, but the awareness of an audience that changed the accounting. This is my property, she said, the alley behind my shop. I'll ask you and your men to get off it. We were just having a conversation. You were hitting someone on my property, she said. I've seen enough to say that clearly and to say it clearly tomorrow to Sheriff Baines if needed, which I will do. Am I understood? Decker stared at her. The two other men had already taken a half step back, recalculating. Decker was the kind of man who hated being made to recalculate, especially by a woman, especially in front of other men. She watched the calculation play across his face, what this cost him, what it cost him to push further, and watched him settle. We're done here, he said, as though it were his decision. Good evening, Clara said. They went. She waited until their footsteps faded down the alley before she let herself exhale. Ryder was leaning against the wall, his thumb pressed against his jaw where Decker had connected. His expression was the same as it had been throughout, the same patience, the same steadiness, but there was a tightness around his eyes that was new. Whether it was pain or something else, she couldn't tell. Come inside, she said. Clara. Ryder, come inside. He came. She sat him at the work table and found the cloth she kept for cuts and wet it at the basin and came back. He watched her come with an expression she couldn't read completely. Something careful and a little wary, like he wasn't used to being fussed over and hadn't decided how he felt about it. She tilted his face up by the chin to look at the jaw. It was going to bruise. There was a small split at the corner of his lip that was bleeding slowly. Hold still, she said. He held still. She pressed the cloth to his lip, and he didn't make a sound. She worked in silence for a minute, and in the silence she was aware of the proximity. His face tilted up, her hand against his jaw, the lamp throwing soft yellow light across the work table in both of them. She was aware of the specific quality of his stillness, which was voluntary. He was letting her do this. That was different from simply not resisting. You didn't hit him back, she said. No. He hit you twice. I know, I was there. Why didn't you? Because I'd have killed him, Ryder said, quietly and without drama. She stopped, looked at him. I'm not saying I would have meant to, he said. I'm saying I'm bigger than I look, and I've been in enough of these that I know how they go. If I hit Decker back the way I'm capable of hitting someone, it stops being a brawl and becomes something else. Then it's me with a problem and you with a scandal. Neither of those things needed to happen. She stared at him. There was no performance in it, no pride, no self-congratulation about his own restraint. He said it as pure practical fact. You made a calculation, she said. I made several. While he was hitting you. It's easier to think when you're not the one swinging, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The cloth was still against his lip, her hand still against his jaw, and she realized suddenly that she'd stopped working and was just holding his face. She took her hand back, set the cloth down on the table, straightened. That scared me, she said. The honesty of it surprised her. Watching that, Ryder looked at her. His dark eyes were steady and direct, and there was something in them she'd been catching glimpses of for weeks. Not the almost smile, not the practical patience. Something underneath those things that she hadn't let herself look at straight on. I know, he said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for getting hit. I'm apologizing for scaring you. She looked away first. The work table was between them. The lamp hummed slightly in the silence. Outside, Silver Creek moved through its evening in ordinary ways. Distant voices, a horse on the street, the faint music from the saloon. Ryder, she said to the work table. Yeah. What are we doing? I was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was looking at his hands, which were flat on the table, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen briefly at the wedding, something opened, temporarily unguarded. I don't know, he said. I thought I knew. When we started this, I thought I knew exactly what it was. And now, he looked at her. Now I know what it isn't, he said. It isn't just useful. For me, it stopped being just useful a while ago. She felt something in her chest that was too large for the space it was trying to occupy. When? She said. The day you fixed my crooked stitch, she meant to say. No, that wasn't right. When was it for you? She corrected. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Duchess, he said. The horse. When you laughed about Duchess. He looked back at his hands. That was, I don't know, something. She stood on her side of the work table and understood that she was standing at a precise edge, that on one side was the safety of the arrangement as it had been, useful, definable, ending when Ethan left, and on the other side was whatever came after admitting what she'd been admitting to herself since midnight after the Morrison wedding. I think, she said carefully, that I am in a very similar position. Ryder raised his eyes. But I'm scared, she said. I want you to know that. I'm scared and I'm not good at... I spent 3 years learning not to need anything. And now... She stopped. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need you to be patient with me. Clara, he said. His voice was different, quieter, something in it that she felt rather than heard. I've been patient with a horse who tried to bite me for 3 weeks. I think I can manage. She laughed. That same involuntary exhale, genuine and sudden. He almost smiled. The work table was between them and neither of them moved across it. And that was fine. That was the right speed. Some things needed to stay at the edge for a little while before they moved. You should go home, she said. Put something cold on that jaw. I'm fine. You'll be less fine tomorrow when it's purple. He stood, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the edge of the table. She walked him to the back door, and he stepped out into the alley that was empty now, quiet, just the dark and the sound of the town settling around them. He turned at the door. In the low light his face was in partial shadow, and the bruise was starting to show at his jaw, and he looked real. Not like a story she'd told herself, or a useful fiction, or a man she'd borrowed for a crisis. Just a real, imperfect, complicated person standing in her alley. Good night, Clara, he said. Good night, she said. She watched him walk down the alley until the dark took him, then she stepped back inside and closed the door and stood in her shop in the lamplight, alone, her hand pressed flat against her sternum where the 2 large feelings still lived. Ethan appeared in her shop the next morning before she'd even turned the sign. She heard the door, the hinge she'd been meaning to fix for months, except Ryder had oiled it 3 weeks ago, and it moved silently now, so it wasn't the hinge, it was the bell, and looked up from threading her needle to find Ethan standing just inside the door. He looked like he hadn't slept well. She recognized it because she hadn't slept well either, though for reasons that felt nothing like his. I heard about last night, he said. Word travels. Are you all right? I wasn't the one who got hit, she said. Is he... Fine, she said. He's fine. Ethan came further into the shop with the specific deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed an entrance. He stopped at the far end of the work table, the same spot she'd stood with Ryder last night, she noticed. The table seemed to be the natural border of every difficult conversation she had these days. Those McKinley men are idiots, Ethan said. What they did was wrong. I'm aware. Clara. His voice dropped to something she recognized. The tone he used when he was trying to communicate sincerity, which he was capable of, she'd never been able to deny that. I need to say something and I need you to hear it. Ethan, I made a mistake, he said. 3 years ago, leaving the way I did. The letter, he exhaled. That was wrong. You deserved better than a letter. Clara set her needle down very carefully on the table. She folded her hands. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I did. I thought about you. After. He was looking at her with an expression that was probably genuine and was absolutely 3 years too late. More than I let myself admit. Ethan. Her voice was quiet, not broken, just clear. Why are you telling me this now? Because I see you with him, he said, and the careful composure cracked slightly, something rawer showing through. And I keep thinking, that should have been me. Staying, being what you needed. I was too afraid or too stupid, or... It doesn't matter which, she said. He blinked. It doesn't matter, she said again. Whether it was fear or stupidity or something else entirely. It happened. You left. I put myself back together, and you came back here with your wife, and you are standing in my shop telling me you made a mistake, and I need you to hear what I'm about to say very clearly. He went still. You don't get to feel robbed, she said. You made a choice. Choices have outcomes. The outcome of yours is that you lost me, and what you're watching now, me and Ryder, and whatever this is becoming, that is not something taken from you. That is just what happened because of the choice you made. She paused. Let it settle. I'm not angry at you anymore. I want you to know that. The anger went somewhere I can't find it. But I'm very, very clear about the fact that you do not have a claim here. Not on my present, not on my future, and not on whatever you feel watching me be happy. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Something worked in his face, complicated, layered, the specific expression of a man who has understood something he'd hoped to avoid understanding. He's good to you, he said finally. Not a question. Yes. Better than... Yes, she said, before he could finish it. He nodded, put his hat back on. His hands were not entirely steady, she noticed, but she didn't allow that to soften anything. I hope it works out, he said. His voice was quieter now, smaller. I hope your marriage does, she said, and meant it. He left. Clara stood in the empty shop and felt the specific texture of that moment. Not triumphant, not devastated, something more complicated than either. She had wanted that confrontation for 3 years in the abstract way you want things, when you imagine yourself sharper and braver than you actually are in the moment. And then the moment had arrived, and she'd been exactly sharp enough and exactly brave enough, and it hadn't felt like victory. It had felt like putting something down that she'd been carrying without noticing. She picked up her needle. She went back to work. At 9:30 the bell rang. She looked up. Ryder stood in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, the bruise along his jaw now fully committed to a shade between purple and yellow that was genuinely impressive. He was looking at her with the direct, quiet attention that she'd stopped trying to interpret and had started simply accepting. Ready? He said. She tied off her thread, set down the fabric, reached for her shawl. Ready, she said. They walked out together into the bright morning, and Clara did not look back at the shop door, did not check the street for Ethan's presence, did not run the calculus of who was watching. She just walked, matching Ryder's unhurried pace, and somewhere around the second corner she became aware that the thing she'd been carrying, the weight she'd grown so accustomed to that she'd stopped noticing it, was lighter than it had been yesterday. Not gone. She wasn't foolish enough to think it was gone, but lighter. Definitively, measurably lighter. Ryder said nothing. He didn't need to. He walked beside her in the morning light with his bruised jaw and his unhurried feet, and that was exactly, precisely enough. 3 days passed after that morning walk, and Ryder didn't come. Not the following day, which Clara told herself was reasonable. He had work. Miller's operation didn't pause, because the social arrangements of a horse trainer had become complicated. Not the day after, which she told herself was also reasonable, though she found herself listening for footsteps on the front step, with an attention she recognized and didn't entirely respect in herself. Not the third morning, which was when she stopped making excuses and admitted that something had changed. She went to Miller's property on the 4th afternoon. She told herself she was walking east for the air, which was the same thing she'd told herself the first time she'd stopped at that fence and watched him work Duchess. The lie was less convincing than it had been then. She walked the east road in the late afternoon light and tried to arrange her thoughts into something orderly, which mostly failed. The training ring was empty when she arrived. The gate was open. Duchess was in the paddock beyond, older and calmer than she'd been that first afternoon. Ryder had done that, had taken that difficult, fearful animal and given her the specific patience required to trust. Clara rested her arms on the fence and looked at the horse, and felt the particular ache of caring about something you have no guarantee of keeping. He left this morning. She turned. It was Miller himself, a broad, gray-haired man with a permanently wind-burned face who smelled of horses and pipe tobacco. I was coming from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, looking at her with an expression that was sympathetic in the way of someone who has watched this kind of thing before. What do you mean he left? Clara said. Packed up, settled his account with me. Miller shrugged, not unkindly. He didn't say where, just said he needed to move on. Said to tell you to... He stopped. Well, he said a few things, and then took most of them back. Said to tell you Duchess would be fine. Clara stared at him. That's all he said, Miller confirmed. Duchess would be fine. She walked home. She walked home and opened the shop and did not turn on any lamps, and sat at the dark work table and stayed there for a while doing nothing much at all, which was not something she did, and which, she thought, said everything about the state she was in. She had told him she was scared. She had told him she needed patience. She had stood at the edge of something honest, and he had listened, and then he had packed a bag and left without a word. Seemed like you needed someone to stand next to you. That was what he'd said the first morning on the boardwalk, and she had believed, had built weeks of careful feeling on the belief that he was someone who stayed, who did the steady, quiet, necessary work of staying. And he hadn't. She sat in the dark shop and breathed. After a while, she got up and lit a lamp and went back to work, because that was what there was to do. She hemmed a skirt. She repaired a split seam on a cavalry officer's coat. She made a list of the supplies she needed to order before the end of the month. She did it all with the mechanical competence of someone who has performed these tasks so many times they require no conscious thought, which left her conscious mind free to do things she would have preferred it not do. She thought about what he'd felt, tried to assemble it from the pieces she had. The conversation in the shop after Decker, it stopped being just useful a while ago. The wedding, and I looked before when you arrived. The quality of his stillness when she'd held his face to clean the cut at his lip. She was not misreading these things. She was not so far gone that she had invented them wholesale. There had been something real in all of it, and she had said as much, had said she was in a similar position, had said she needed patience. And he had looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "I can manage," and she had believed him. And now Duchess would be fine. That was what he'd left her. Well, she thought, with the particular internal voice she used for conclusions, she didn't enjoy reaching. There it is. She finished the cavalry coat, she went to bed. She slept badly and woke before dawn and lay in the gray early light, and made herself do the accounting she'd been avoiding all night. She was in love with Ryder Kane. She turned the fact over in her mind, looked at it from the various angles available. There it was. Not the comfortable warmth of liking, not the useful fiction she'd invented to manage Ethan, not the complicated gratitude for someone who had been kind to her at the right moment, love. The inconvenient, fully committed, makes you worse at sowing kind. The kind that had apparently decided to take up residence without asking first, and had now made itself so thoroughly at home that she couldn't imagine the interior without it. She was in love with a man who had just left town. Perfect, she said, to the ceiling. She got up and opened the shop. By 9 o'clock she had made 3 uneven stitches, which was now her reliable indicator of emotional disturbance. She took them out, made them again, straight this time, through an act of will. She was on the 4th when she heard the bell above the door and looked up expecting Walt Carson or Harriet Bloom or anyone other than who it was. Ethan stood in the doorway. She felt, looking at him, almost nothing, a faint irritation, the way you feel when an old problem resurfaces on a day when you already have a new one. He looked at her expression and something in his face deflated slightly, the specific deflation of a man who had prepared for an emotional encounter and found the other person busy with different emotions entirely. "You heard," he said. "That he left?" Yes. Ethan came in. He looked, she thought, genuinely uncomfortable, which was not an expression she associated with him, and which made her trust it more than his comfortable ones. "Margaret and I are leaving tomorrow," he said. "All right. The legal business is finished," he paused. "Clara, Ethan," she said. "I said what I needed to say to you. I don't have more. I know." He stopped at the table. "I know you do. I want to say something before I go, and I want to say it without expecting anything from you because of it." He took a breath. "He's not a drifter. Whatever I said before, whatever I implied, that was me being threatened and saying something stupid. He's not a drifter. I asked around after." He stopped, seemed to be choosing words. "He came here from a hard situation somewhere north. I don't know the whole of it, and it's not mine to know. But I know he works hard and he's honest, and the way he looked at you when he thought nobody was watching was—" He stopped again. Clara was very still. "It was the way I should have looked at you," Ethan said, "and didn't. And I wanted to say that." She looked at him across the work table. The morning light was coming through the front window and lying across the pine surface Harold had built, slightly uneven with the folded leather beneath the warped leg, exactly as it always had. "Where did he go?" she said. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know." She nodded, looked down at the fabric under her hands. "Safe travels, Ethan," she said. He left. She stood there. Then she went to the window and looked out at the main street of Silver Creek in the morning light, the feed store, the dry goods, Mabel's diner trailing its permanent smoke. And she thought about what Ethan had said and what it changed and what it didn't, and she stood there for 2 minutes or 10 or some amount of time she couldn't account for. And then she said aloud, clearly, to no one in the empty shop, If you came here, Ryder Kane, and then left because you were scared, that is the most enormous hypocrisy I have ever encountered. The shop didn't answer. She went back to work. He came back at 4 o'clock. She heard the back door, not the bell, the back door, the one that faced the alley, and knew it before she looked up. The same way she'd learned the quality of his footsteps on the front step over weeks of mornings. She knew it was him before she saw him and hated, briefly, how much she knew that. He looked like he'd been riding, dust on his hat and coat, something in his face that was the specific afterstate of a long, hard decision. Not settled, exactly, but landed. He stood just inside the back doorway with his hat in his hand, the way Ethan had stood in the front doorway 3 weeks ago, and the comparison was not one she wanted to make, but her mind made it anyway, and the difference was stark and immediate. Ethan had come with calculation. Ryder stood in her doorway the way Duchess had finally stood at the fence rail, not because it was safe or certain, but because something in him had concluded it was worth it. "You left," she said. "I came back," he said. "That's not an explanation." He ran his hand over the back of his neck. Not Ethan's gesture, not performed, just a man working out how to say something true. I know it's not." He looked at her directly, the way he always did when the words were real rather than useful. "I panicked." She waited. "That conversation," he said. "In the shop after Decker. And then the morning after, walking with you, and I've been in a lot of places, Clara. I've done a lot of moving. It was easier before. And then I was here, and every morning was—" He stopped, started again. "I've spent a long time making sure I didn't need anything I couldn't carry alone. And then somewhere in the middle of all of this, I couldn't do that anymore, and that scared me more than anything Decker did." She looked at him. The lamp on the work table was the only light, and it threw his face in warm and shadow, and he looked tired and real and bruised in more ways than one. "So you ran," she said. "I rode out to the North Ridge and sat there for 3 days being an idiot," he said. "Yes." "An idiot," she repeated. "Comprehensive," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "And then what?" "And then I thought about what you said, that you were scared, that you'd spent 3 years learning not to need anything." He looked at his hat, then back at her. "And I thought about how you said it, and how you still said it anyway, and I realized I was letting a woman with considerably more courage than me do all the work." A pause. "I came back." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of mornings alone, and one letter that burned clean in a stove, and 10,000 straight stitches made through an act of will. She thought about what it had cost her to learn to be sufficient on her own, and what it was costing her now to admit she didn't want to be. "If you leave again," she said, don't come back." "Understood," he said, immediately. No hesitation. "I mean it. I know you do." He took a step further into the shop. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I don't want to go anywhere. That's what 3 days on a ridge taught me. I had nowhere I wanted to be except here." He stopped at the near side of the work table. "I know I don't have anything figured out. I've got a job that'll last through fall and some money saved and a general idea about some land east of here that Miller mentioned months back. That's all I've got. I'm not Ethan Mercer with a fortune and a plan. I'm a horse trainer with one good suit and opinions about fence construction." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a knot loosens when you find the right thread to pull. "2 suits, she said. He blinked. "I made you a second one," she said. 3 weeks ago, when you weren't here. I had the measurements from when I fitted you for the Morrison wedding, and I had the fabric, and She stopped. "I didn't have anything else to do with my hands." He looked at her. The almost smile was there, and then past it, something she'd only seen once or twice. The opened face, the unguarded thing underneath the steadiness. "Clara," he said. "Don't make it into something larger than it is," she said, though it was exactly as large as it was. "Come around this table." He came around the table. He stopped when they were close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes, and she met them, and he looked at her the way Ethan had described, the way she hadn't been able to see because she'd always been beside him rather than across the street. And it turned out that Ethan, in this one specific thing, had been exactly right. It was something you could not perform. It was something entirely true. She kissed him first because she was done waiting for things to happen to her. It was not a perfect kiss. Her nose bumped his once, and he was still dusty from the road, and the work table was behind her, and she caught the edge of it with her hip, and none of that mattered at all. What mattered was that it was real, and that he kissed her back with a steadiness and a gentleness and a certainty that felt like the man himself, unhurried, unperforming, entirely present. When she pulled back, he rested his forehead briefly against hers, his eyes closed, and she felt him exhale, a long, slow release that felt like something he'd been holding for a considerable time. "I'm sorry I left," he said quietly. "You came back," she said. "Work on that part." He looked at her. The almost smile arrived and then went past itself into something warmer and less guarded. "Yeah," he said, "I will." What followed was not simple. She wanted to be honest about that, then and later. They were two people with complicated histories trying to build something new without the benefit of a clear blueprint, and it showed. She was, as she'd warned him, not good at needing things. She caught herself pulling back at odd moments, becoming very busy at the work table when a conversation got too close to something important, making decisions alone out of habit when she didn't have to anymore. I was not forthcoming about the thing that had brought him here from the north, whatever it was, and there were evenings when she could feel it present in the room like a third person, and she had to decide whether to push or wait, and she didn't always choose right. They argued, not often, but genuinely. The first time about the land east of town that Ryder had looked at and priced and described to her across her kitchen table one evening with the careful enthusiasm of a man who has wanted something for a long time and is still a little afraid to want it. She'd said it was too much money. He'd said he had the money. She'd said the water access was uncertain. He'd said he'd had it assessed. She'd said it was a lot of work for one person. And he'd looked at her across the kitchen table with a patience that was wearing slightly at the edges and said, "I wasn't thinking one person, Clara." She'd gone quiet. He'd let her be quiet. 3 days later, she'd walked out to look at the land herself, without him, on a Tuesday morning while he was at Miller's, and stood in the middle of the brown grass and the big western sky, and turned slowly, looking at the shape of it. The slope to the south that would block the worst winter wind. The creek that ran along the north edge, small but reliable, she thought. The view east where the territory went on and on in the way that used to make her feel small, and lately made her feel something else. More spacious. Like the world was larger than she'd been living in. She stayed for an hour. When she got back to the shop, Ryder was sitting on the front step waiting for her, which he did sometimes when the shop was closed and he had nowhere else to be. He looked at her when she came up the street and read her face in the way he'd gotten frighteningly good at. "What do you think?" he asked. "The water access is still uncertain," she said. "I know." "You'd need to sink a proper well." "I know." "And the slope on the south face needs fencing before winter." "I know that too." She stopped in front of him. "I think," she said, "that it's the right land." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes settled the way things settle when they found the right ground. He stood up. He was close. Not as close as they'd been in the shop that first evening, but close enough. "I think so too," he said. He bought it in October, 2 weeks before the first frost. The paperwork was signed in the lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and Ryder came to the shop afterward with the deed folded in his inside coat pocket. The good coat, the one she'd made, which he wore for things that mattered, and sat at her work table and put the deed down on the pine surface and looked at it for a long moment, like a man who is still working out how something real feels after a long time of things being uncertain. "It's mine," he said. He said it quietly, and there was something in the quiet that told her it meant more than land. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. The ranch was nothing yet. A property line and a deed and a slope of brown grass and a creek that would need work. They stood on it together on the first Sunday after the purchase, in the early November cold, the sky the pale-washed blue that came before real winter. Ryder walked the boundary while Clara stood in the middle and turned slowly the way she'd turned alone in October. And she felt the same spaciousness, and it was larger now because he was in it. "There," he said, coming back to where she stood, pointing at the southern rise. "That's where I want to build." She looked at the rise, imagined it, the structure that didn't exist yet, the work that hadn't been done, the life that would happen in rooms that were currently sky. "It'll take time," she said. "Yes." "And money." "Yes." "And more work than you're probably estimating right now." He looked at her sideways. "Are you trying to talk me out of it?" "No," she said. "I'm going in with clear eyes." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the eastern flats and moved through the dry grass around them, and she pulled her coat tighter, and he didn't move closer, but she was aware of him beside her with the awareness she'd stopped trying to manage. It was just a fact now, like the slope, or the creek, or the pale winter sky. He was there. She was glad he was there. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I was not looking at the rise anymore. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now. The full, open thing, no almost about it. He reached into his coat pocket. Not the inside pocket with the deed, the outside one. He brought out something small, and when she saw what it was, she understood that he had planned this. Had planned it for this specific place on this specific day with a deliberateness that was entirely him. It was a ring, simple, a thin band with a small dark stone she didn't immediately know. Not expensive, not a statement, just a ring chosen carefully by a man who chose things carefully. I don't have a speech, he said. I thought about one and it came out sounding like someone else, so I'll just say what's true. He held the ring between his fingers, looking at her. I came to Silver Creek with nothing settled. I didn't plan to stay. I didn't plan any of this. A pause. And this is the first place I've stood in a very long time and felt like the ground was solid under my feet. That's you. That's what you did. And I'd like to keep standing on solid ground, if you'll have me. Clara looked at him. At the ring. At the land around them that was nothing yet and would become something. At the man who had stood beside her on a boardwalk with a lie about a coat because he couldn't stand watching her be alone in a hard moment. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her hand. It fit. She would learn later that he'd asked Mabel Pruitt for her ring size, and that Mabel had known immediately and provided the information with the satisfaction of a woman who had seen this coming since the second week. Clara, when she found out, laughed until her eyes watered, and Ryder looked quietly pleased with himself in the way he did when something had worked out better than he'd let himself expect. They walked back across the land as the sun dropped and the cold came in harder, and the ground was uneven and the grass caught at her boots, and she stumbled once and he caught her arm and didn't let go, and they walked the rest of the way like that. His hand at her elbow, then her arm through his, adjusting by small increments until they found the way that fit. It was not graceful. It was not easy. It was two imperfect people on imperfect ground, figuring out what it felt like to choose each other on purpose. It felt, Clara thought, as they came back to the road and Silver Creek lay ahead of them in the early dark, its lights beginning to show in the windows. It felt like the most honest thing she had ever done. Not the best day of her life. Not perfect. Just real and chosen and hers. She kept walking. The first winter on the cane land was the kind that tested everything. It arrived early and without the usual warning signs. No gradual cooling, no gentle transition. One morning in late November, the sky went white, and by afternoon 3 feet of snow had buried the foundation stakes Ryder had driven into the ground, marking where the house would stand. The creek froze solid enough to walk on. The wind came off the eastern flats in a way that found every gap in the temporary shelter Ryder had built from salvaged timber at the edge of the property, where he was staying while the house went up. Clara saw the shelter for the first time the morning after the storm, and said nothing for a long moment. "You're staying in that," she said. "It keeps the wind off." "Ryder, it's a box. It's a well-constructed box." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression that meant he had already argued this with himself, and arrived at a conclusion he intended to hold. She recognized the expression because it was usually the one preceding the times he was actually wrong. "You'll stay above the shop," she said, "in my father's old room, until the house is weather-tight." "Clara, I'm not asking," she said. "That room has been empty for 4 years, and it's warm, and there's no reason you should be sleeping in a constructed box on your own land when there's a bed 30 feet from my front door." She paused. "We're engaged. The town already has opinions about us. Nobody is going to be surprised." He moved in that evening quietly, with a single bag and very little ceremony, which was how he did most things. He took Harold's old room with the single window that faced east and the braided rug Clara had never replaced, and the low shelf of Harold's books that she'd also never moved. And somehow the room absorbed him without it feeling like an intrusion. Clara noticed, one morning 2 weeks in, that he'd straightened the books by height and put a small piece of folded paper under the shelf's front leg, which was slightly uneven, the same way she used folded leather under the work table leg downstairs. She didn't mention it. It meant more to her without words. The house went up in stages, which was the only way a house went up when the man building it was also running a horse operation. managing a growing list of clients from ranches across the territory, and occasionally sleeping in borrowed rooms above a tailor shop. Ryder had help from Bill Garrett, Tom's older brother, a carpenter by trade who owed Ryder something related to a horse he'd trained and refused to elaborate on, and from two other men who came on weekends for wages and worked with the particular focused energy of men who knew the value of a good roof before spring. Clara learned to hand tools. She learned which wood was right for which purpose, learned to hold a board steady while a nail was driven, learned that construction had its own kind of rhythm that was not entirely different from sewing, the same attention to how things fit together, the same unforgiving nature of a seam or a joint that was a quarter-inch off. She was not good at it in the beginning. She hit her thumb with a hammer on a Saturday in December and said a word that made Bill Garrett drop his level. Language, Ryder said, not looking up. I hit my thumb. I know, language. It's my thumb. I'll say what I want about it. Bill Garrett found something to attend to on the other side of the structure. Ryder came over, took her hand, looked at the thumb, pressed the edges gently in the way he pressed bruises on horses, assessing, not performing concern. It's not broken, he said. I know it's not broken. You'll want to ice it. I'm aware of how thumbs work, Ryder. He looked at her, the almost smile. You want to take a break? I want to go back to work, she said. Hand me the hammer. He handed her the hammer. She went back to work. He watched her for a moment with an expression she didn't see because she was looking at the board, but Bill Garrett saw it from across the structure and filed it away and mentioned it to his wife later that evening, who mentioned it to Harriet Bloom, who mentioned it to Mabel Pruitt, and by the following week it had taken on a slightly different shape in the retelling. Something about Clara Holloway swearing on a rooftop, and Ryder Kane looking at her like she'd hung the stars, which was not precisely accurate but was, Clara supposed when she heard it, not entirely wrong in spirit. The wedding was in April, before the house was finished. This was Clara's decision, which surprised people who had expected her to wait for the house the way women were supposed to wait for everything. The right conditions, the perfect timing, the fully assembled future before committing to it. She had spent 3 years waiting for things to be settled enough. She was done waiting. They married on a Saturday morning in the crooked steepled church at the north end of town, with essentially the whole of Silver Creek in attendance, because the whole of Silver Creek had been personally invested in this development since the morning. Ryder had appeared on the boardwalk with a fictional coat, and the town had recognized something real before either of its participants did. Mabel Pruitt cried, which she denied afterward. Harriet Bloom did not cry, but gripped her husband's arm with an intensity that left marks. Old Walt Carson's dog, somehow present despite being no one's guest, sat at the end of a pew and behaved with improbable dignity. Clara made her own dress. Of course she made her own dress. It was ivory wool, simply cut, with small buttons she'd carved from bone herself over 3 evenings at the work table. Nothing elaborate. She had made elaborate things for other people her whole adult life and knew exactly how much labor elaborate required, and had decided that what she wanted for her wedding was a dress that fit her perfectly, and moved when she moved and required no management. It fit perfectly. It moved when she moved. Ryder wore the suit she'd made him. Not the first one, the second one. The one she'd made alone during the 3 days he'd been sitting on a ridge being, by his own description, an idiot. She had never told him when she made it. He had found out eventually, and when he did, he went quiet in the particular way that meant something had landed somewhere deep. Standing at the front of the church beside him, she held his hand and said the words that needed saying, and he said the words that needed saying. And when it was done, he looked at her with the full open expression. No almost, no guardedness, just everything. And she looked back at him the same way, and that was that. Afterward, at the reception in the square that Mabel had organized with the tactical efficiency of a military campaign, Ryder danced with her badly and without apology. He was not a man built for dancing, too deliberate in his movements, too accustomed to economy of motion to know what to do with motion that served no purpose except pleasure. He stepped on her foot twice. She stepped on his once deliberately, to balance the accounting. He laughed, the real one, not the quiet almost version. And she thought she would keep the sound of it for the rest of her life and be right about the worth of it. The house was finished in June. It was not large. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 above, a kitchen lean-to on the south side, a porch that ran the full front face and caught the evening light in a way that Ryder had calculated deliberately when he chose the orientation of the structure. The wood was plain and the windows were not fancy, and the front door hung slightly heavier than intended because of a miscalculation in the frame that Bill Garrett said he would come back and fix and never did. So it stayed slightly heavy, and they both learned to lean into it when they came home, which eventually became so automatic they stopped noticing. On the day they moved in, or rather, on the day Clara brought the last box across from the room above the shop and set it on the kitchen table and looked around at the walls that were theirs, the floors they had helped lay, the windows that framed the land they owned, she stood there for a long moment and did the accounting. She had started over once before, in her shop after Ethan left, and that accounting had been made in loss, everything subtracted, what remained after. This accounting was addition, not the naive kind, not the calculation of someone who hadn't lost anything and didn't understand what loss looked like, but the measured, clear-eyed counting of someone who knew exactly what things cost and had decided that these things were worth the price. One crooked work table, inherited from a man she loved. One tailor shop still operating on the corner of 3rd and Main because she had not closed it and did not intend to. One husband who fixed things without being asked and said what he meant, and had once sat on a ridge for 3 days being an idiot and come back anyway. One piece of land that had tested them through one winter and would test them through more. She added it up and it came to more than she'd had before and less than she'd expected it to feel like, which was not a complaint. It felt like life rather than story, and she had decided that life was what she wanted. "What are you doing?" Ryder said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "Accounting," she said. He looked at her. "Does it balance?" "Yes," she said, "it balances." He nodded like that settled something. Then he said, "I found a bird in the chimney," and the accounting was set aside for the practical matter of the bird, which set the tone for most of their days in a way that felt exactly right. The ranch grew slowly and with considerable difficulty, because that was the nature of things in the territory, and they both knew it. Ryder's horses developed a reputation that spread the way good reputations do, not through announcement, but through results. A rancher 50 miles north sent a difficult mare that 2 other trainers had refused, and Ryder worked her through a full month and sent her back transformed, and that rancher told 2 others, and those 2 told more. By the 2nd year there was a waiting list. By the 3rd there were horses on the property from ranches Clara had never heard of in country she'd never seen. And Ryder had hired a hand named George, a quiet young man from somewhere south, who was good with animals and bad with words and fit into the operation the same way Ryder fit into most things, without excess, without drama, by doing the work in front of him. Clara ran the tailor shop through all of it. She walked into Silver Creek 4 mornings a week and opened the shop at 9 and worked until 4 and walked home. And in the evening she sat at the kitchen table and did the other work, the work she had not told anyone about for longer than was probably reasonable. She had been writing for years, since before Ethan, in fact. Small things, observations, the kind of writing you do in the back of ledger books when the entries are done and you still have pen in hand. Frontier life had a texture that she found she needed to record. The specific quality of winter on the high plains. The way a town like Silver Creek held its people. The weight and warmth of it. The things she saw in her shop that nobody else saw. The stories written in hems and alterations, the lives visible in fabric. She had never shown any of it to anyone. She kept it in a box under the bed that had once held Harold's winter blankets, written in the cramped hand she used when she didn't expect anyone to read it. Ryder found the box in the 2nd year of their marriage, by accident, looking for a boot he thought had slid under the bed. He came to dinner that evening and set the box on the table between them and sat down and looked at her. She looked at the box, looked at him. "You read it." "Some of it," he paused. "Should I not have?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Nobody has." "Why?" She thought about how to answer that. "Because it might not be any good," she said, "and I'd rather not know." He was quiet for a moment. "It's good," he said. "You're biased." "I'm a measured person," he said. "I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true." She looked at him. He looked back with the particular directness that she had learned meant he had already decided something and was waiting for her to arrive at the same place. "Send something to the territorial paper," he said. "Ryder, what's the worst that happens? They reject it, and I know, and I have to live with knowing." "Clara." His voice was gentle but not soft. The distinction mattered. "You have lived with not knowing for years already. Knowing is better, whatever the knowing is." She looked at the box. Inside it were several years of her interior life in a cramped hand, and the question of whether any of it was worth anything beyond the private satisfaction of having written it. She sent a piece to the territorial paper the following week. A short thing, barely 800 words, about a winter morning on the eastern flats seen from the front porch of a ranch that hadn't existed 3 years earlier. She sent it and told Ryder she'd sent it, and then told him she didn't want to talk about it, and he respected that with the ease of a man who understood the difference between support and pressure. The reply came 3 weeks later. They wanted it. They wanted more. She sat with the letter for a long time at the kitchen table. Ryder came in from the yard, read her face, and said nothing except coffee, and she said yes. And he made the coffee and sat across from her and waited. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it, looked up. "Well?" he said. "Well," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. She felt something in her chest that was different from the love she'd felt before. Not bigger, but wider. More layered. The love of being known, of having someone set a box on a table because they believed it deserved to be opened. She published 7 pieces in the territorial paper that year. The following year, a publisher in the eastern city wrote to her. The year after that, her first book, a collection of frontier essays that she described to Ryder as "the box organized," was printed and distributed across the territory, and then further, slowly, in the way that honest things find their way to people who need them. She was not famous. She did not become famous. She became something more durable, read, recognized in the specific way that writing is recognized when it's true enough that people feel it's about their own lives, not just the writers. Letters came to Silver Creek addressed to Clara Kane, and she read every one of them at the kitchen table and answered the ones that needed answering and kept the ones that mattered in a different box from the writing, a smaller one, that she kept on the shelf in the kitchen where she could see it. Life on the ranch did not get easier as the years went on. It got more familiar, which was different. The difficulty changed shape, the winter that took 4 horses and nearly bankrupted them, which required a year of careful rebuilding and the kind of marital arithmetic nobody writes about. The specific negotiations of 2 people who are each proud and each worried and each trying not to let the other one see how worried they are. The drought in the 5th year that turned the creek to a trickle and the grass to straw and required decisions Clara would still have opinions about 20 years later. The morning Ryder came in from the east field with a broken rib from a horse that had gone wrong during a session, sitting at the kitchen table gray-faced and trying to act like it was minor, and Clara standing over him with her hands on her hips saying, "That is not minor." Ryder and him saying, "It's 1 rib," and her saying, "That is still a rib," and George standing in the doorway, looking at the floor. There were also children. The first, a boy named Harold, arrived in the 3rd year of the marriage, ahead of schedule, and with the comprehensive disruption that first children reliably deliver regardless of how much you've prepared. Harold Kane was born with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness and an absolute refusal to sleep at predictable hours that persisted into childhood, and Clara suspected would persist through his entire life. He learned to walk early and immediately used the skill to get into things he shouldn't. He followed Ryder into the horse paddock at 18 months and stood next to Duchess, who was old now, quieter, her difficult years well behind her, with his small hand on the horse's leg, and looked up at her with an expression of pure amazement. Ryder stood behind him and said nothing. He looked at Clara over the boy's head with an expression she had no words for then, and still had no words for years later, only the feeling of it, something complete, something she could not have designed and would not have thought to want until it was simply there. "Duchess," Harold said. It was the 3rd word he'd learned, after Mama and the dog's name. "That's right," Ryder said. The second child was a girl named Ruth, 4 years after Harold, who arrived with more ceremony than her brother, and immediately established herself as a person of specific opinions and considerable volume. Ruth had Clara's coloring and some quality around her eyes that was neither parent entirely, just her own. She became Ryder's shadow from the age of 3, following him through every task on the property, with a running commentary on the quality of his work that was, Clara noted privately, not entirely unfair. "The fence is crooked," Ruth announced one morning, age 4, standing at the paddock rail. "It's within tolerance," Ryder said. "It's crooked," Ruth said. A pause. Ryder looked at the fence. "You're right," he said. "I'll fix it." Clara, watching from the porch, said nothing. She was writing in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying, and she wrote that exchange down, and a version of it appeared 2 years later in her second book. And a woman in a town 400 miles east wrote her a letter saying she'd read that passage aloud to her husband, and he'd laughed for the first time in 6 months. And Clara kept that letter in the small box on the kitchen shelf. The tailor shop changed as the years passed. She hired a girl named Annie Torrance at the start of the 7th year, 18, deft with a needle, quick to learn. And the shop absorbed her the way it had absorbed everything Clara fed it. Clara taught her measurements and fittings and the particular skill of knowing what a person actually needed rather than what they thought they wanted. She taught her that a crooked stitch was not the end of anything. You took it out and made it straight. She closed the shop 2 mornings a week to write. Nobody complained. Silver Creek changed around them, the way towns change. The same and different, the buildings shifting, people arriving and some leaving, the next generation taking the places of the previous one. Mabel Pruitt retired from the diner at 68 and handed it to her nephew, who burned the coffee with the same unreliable devotion, which felt like continuity. Harriet Bloom's hair went white, and her opinions remained entirely unchanged. Old Walt Carson died on a Tuesday in March, peacefully, which was not how most people had expected him to go, and Clara sat with the specific grief of losing someone who had shoveled snow from her step for years without being asked, the quiet love of unremarkable faithful presence. She thought about her father more as she got older, went back to the work table in the shop and ran her hand over the pine surface, the slight unevenness of it, the folded leather beneath the warped leg. Harold, she thought, would have liked Ryder. Not immediately. He would have been suspicious first, would have asked him pointed questions about fence construction and horse training, and watched him with the assessing attention of a man who had raised a daughter alone and was protective in the specific way of fathers who tried to hide it. And Ryder would have answered the fence questions seriously and the horse questions with enthusiasm, and Harold would have warmed to him slowly and then completely, the way he warmed to everything he eventually trusted. She wrote about her father once, a single piece, for herself, not for publication. She sat at the kitchen table on a November evening with the wind off the flats and the children asleep upstairs and Ryder reading at the other end of the table, and she wrote about Harold Holloway and the warped table and the folded leather, and the specific texture of growing up in a shop where things were made and repaired, and the quiet lesson of that, which she hadn't understood she'd learned until she was old enough to see where it had taken her. When she finished, she put down the pen and sat looking at what she'd written. Ryder looked up. "Done?" "Done?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her face. "Good writing or hard writing?" "Both," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. That was all. She looked at his hand on her, the working hand, scarred along the thumb from something years ago he'd mentioned once, and she'd filed away, the knuckle still slightly swollen from the winter he'd broken 2 fingers and been stubborn about it. And she thought that hands tell the truth about a life in a way that faces sometimes don't. His hands told a story of work and patience and the occasional failure of judgment and the consistent return to trying. Her hands did too. She looked at them together on the table and thought, this is what chosen looks like. Not the beginning of it, the long middle of it. The news about Ethan Mercer arrived in the 11th year of their marriage, indirectly, the way news travels in territories where distances are large and connections are loose. A letter to Clara from a woman she'd done work for years ago, now living in a city east of the territory, who mentioned in passing that she'd heard Margaret Mercer had left her husband the previous winter, and that Ethan had sold his interests in a mining concern under difficult circumstances, and that he was living modestly somewhere in the South. Clara read the letter. Read that section again. Set the letter down. She sat with it for a while, trying to locate what she felt, doing the honest accounting the way she always did. There was not satisfaction. She looked for that first because she'd expected it and found it wasn't there. There was something closer to a tired sadness. The sadness you feel for a person who made the wrong bets on themselves and had to pay for it in the long, slow way. Ethan had not been a bad man. She'd had years now to arrive at that conclusion without it costing her anything. He'd been a frightened one, which was different and less interesting as a category. She thought about the letter she'd burned in the stove 11 years ago. The careful margins. The revised sentences. The man who had tried to leave well and hadn't known how. She thought about the morning on the boardwalk, the 2 fingers to the hat brim, and standing there unable to move. She thought about what had come after. She folded the letter and set it in the kitchen drawer. Not the box, the ordinary drawer, and went out to the porch. Ryder was at the fence line east of the house, working on the section Ruth had been right about 2 years ago, and he'd fixed, and that had shifted again over the winter. He was in the low afternoon light with his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back, doing something precise with the wire strands, and he didn't look up when she came out, but she knew he'd heard the door. She sat on the porch steps and watched him work. The land was brown and gold in the late autumn, the creek catching light to the north, the sky doing the thing it did at this hour, in this season that she had described in writing more than once, without ever quite getting it right. Harold was at the barn. Ruth was inside, probably reading, which she did with the same comprehensive dedication her mother brought to it, and her father brought to fence line assessments. Ethan Mercer's business failed, she said, and his wife left him. Ryder didn't stop working. He finished the section he was on, checked the tension, moved to the next post. When did you hear? Just now. A letter. He worked. She waited. That was how they did things. He didn't rush toward conclusions. She didn't require him to. How do you feel about it? He said after a while. Sad for him, she said, in a distant way. Like reading about something that happened to someone you used to know. Ryder nodded, set the wire tool down, turned and looked at her from the fence line, squinting slightly against the afternoon light. He came to see me once, he said, before he left. That last week. She straightened. You didn't tell me that. No. He picked up the tool again. He asked me to take care of you, like he had the right to ask that. A pause. I told him I didn't need his permission and I didn't need his instructions, and that you weren't something that required taking care of in the way he meant it. Clara looked at him. What did he say? He said I was probably right. Ryder moved to the next section. Then he left. She sat with that. The small, strange completeness of it. The two men in her life having a conversation she hadn't known about and would not have wanted to witness, arriving at some understanding that Ethan had needed and Ryder had given without sentimentality. You never told me, she said. Didn't need to, he said. Until now. Why now? He looked up at her. Because now it's just a story, he said. Before it was something with edges. Now it's just something that happened. She looked at him across the brown autumn grass and the imperfectly repaired fence. This man who had appeared beside her on a boardwalk with a lie about a coat and had stayed and stayed and stayed through winters and droughts and broken ribs and crooked fences and the ordinary grinding days that nobody wrote about because they didn't know how to make them sound like what they were, which was everything, which was the whole of it. Ryder, she said. Yeah, come inside when you're done. I'll make dinner. 20 minutes, he said. He was back in 15. Years passed the way years do when they are full. Not slowly, not quickly, but in layers that you only understand looking back, each one changing the depth of what's beneath it. Harold grew into a young man with Ryder's patience and Clara's tongue, which was a combination that proved useful in the horse business and occasionally alarming in social situations. He took over the training operation gradually, the way the right transitions happen, not with announcement, but with the natural shift of someone stepping into the work they were built for. Ruth went east to study, which cost Clara a specific private grief she managed by being loudly supportive and writing 2 letters a week, and came back 3 years later with a husband named Thomas, who was a doctor, and who Ryder assessed in the way he assessed all things, quietly, over time, by watching what they did rather than what they said, and eventually approved of on the grounds that he listened when Ruth talked and fixed a broken chair at the kitchen table without being asked. The grandchildren arrived, first Harold's and then Ruth's, and the house that had been built in pieces over a difficult winter suddenly had new noise in it and new weight, and Clara learned the specific texture of this love. Not parental love, not spousal love, something wider and less anxious. The love of someone who has already learned most of the hard lessons and can now simply be present for the people coming up behind. One evening, a summer evening, the sky, the impossible color it turned in late July, the kind of blue that made you understand why people tried to paint it and failed. Clara was on the porch watching 3 of her grandchildren run through the field to the east, which was long grass now and golden in the light. And she heard the door behind her, and Ryder came out and settled into the chair beside her the way he'd been settling into chairs beside her for 20-some years. They sat for a while without talking. This was one of the things she would have told a younger version of herself, if she could have. That the deepest love was partly this, the ability to sit in silence with someone and have the silence be full rather than empty. Harold had given her some version of this. Ryder had completed it. She was not going to be sentimental about it, but she was going to be honest, and honestly it was one of the great gifts of her life. One of the grandchildren, Ruth's youngest, a girl named Lily, who was 5 and had opinions about everything, had stopped running and was attempting to communicate with a grasshopper in the long grass. The other two had raced ahead and were visible at the tree line, small shapes in the golden evening. "I was thinking," Clara said, "about the boardwalk." Ryder looked at her. He knew which boardwalk. They did not have many, but they both knew the one she meant. "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't walked over," she said. "I would have gone back inside eventually, turned the sign to open, made the crooked stitches I was going to make, gotten through the day." "Yes," he said, "and you would have—" "What were you even doing on Main Street that morning?" "Getting coffee from Mabel," he said. "I walked past every morning on the way to Miller's." She turned to look at him. "You walked past every morning?" "Yes. And you'd seen me before." He looked at her with the expression she knew completely now, the settled, quiet one that meant he was being careful with words, because what he was saying was true, and the truth deserved care. "I'd seen you before," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. There was gray in his hair now, at the temples and through the dark, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened over the years into something that was not just age, but the record of all the squinting into western light, all the patient hours in the training ring, all the winters and the laughter and the times he'd looked at her the way she'd learned to look back. His hands were on the armrests of the chair, the hands she knew completely, and the ring on his left hand was worn and slightly dull from years of work. "You walked past every morning," she said again, not as a question this time. "Every morning," he confirmed. She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, in the complicated amusement of someone who has been given, retroactively, a piece of information that reframes a thing she thought she understood. "And that morning," she said, "you saw me standing there and you looked like the bravest person I'd ever seen," he said simply. "Standing there, not moving, like it cost you everything and you were paying it anyway." She looked at him. The evening light was on his face, and Lily had given up on the grasshopper and was running back toward the house, her small feet loud on the dry ground, and above them the sky was doing its impossible July blue. "It did cost everything," Clara said. "I know." He reached over and found her hand on the armrest. "You got it back, though." She looked at her hand in his, worn now, like his, the hands of someone who had made 10,000 stitches and built fences and kneaded bread and written books, and held her children and her husband through the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of days. "More than back," she said. Lily burst onto the porch in the way 5-year-olds burst into spaces, completely, without any reservation, and immediately wanted to know if there were cookies, and whether Grandpa Ryder could look at a bug she'd found, and whether Grandma Clara would read the book with the horses in it tonight. "After supper," Clara said. "Yes to the bug," Ryder said. "Maybe on the cookies." Lily weighed this and found it acceptable and ran back inside to report to the others. Clara and Ryder sat in the quiet left behind her. "I'm going to put that in a book," Clara said. "Lily and the grasshopper." "All of it," she said. "This. The evening. The whole—" She stopped. "It would take a long time." "You have time," he said. She looked out at the field where her grandchildren were visible now, coming back through the gold grass toward the house, the land rolling away behind them to the east where the territory went on for miles in the blue evening. The ranch that had been a deed and a slope of brown grass and a man's careful dream. The house built piece by piece through a difficult winter. The life assembled from the aftermath of a letter she'd burned in a stove 12 years ago, from the wreckage of the story she'd thought she was supposed to be living. She had written once, in the 3rd book, in an essay she'd almost cut and then decided to keep because it was the truest thing in it, that the worst things that happen to us are not the opposite of the good things. They are the ground the good things grow in. That this was not comfort, exactly, and not a lesson you could learn in advance. It was only visible from the other side, and only if you'd done the work of getting there. She believed it, had believed it longer than she'd been able to articulate it, had lived it imperfectly and without a map, through the crooked stitches and the 3 days on a ridge and the hammered thumb and the drought year and the broken rib and all the ordinary unglamorous days of learning how to stay. The worst day of her life had been the morning on the boardwalk. She knew now that was not precisely true. The worst day had been years before, the morning she'd opened a letter with steady hands, and not yet understood what she was reading, and burned it clean, and opened the shop. That was the worst day. The boardwalk morning had been the worst day's gift. Ryder squeezed her hand once. He was looking out at the field, at the grandchildren making their way back, at the light going long and golden across everything they'd built. She squeezed back. Lily was at the door again. "Supper's ready. Mama says come now or it gets cold." Clara stood. Ryder stood. She picked up the empty coffee cups they'd brought out an hour ago, and he held the door, the heavy door that had never been properly fixed and required a lean to open. The door of the house they had built from a deed and a dream and a significant amount of disputed fence construction. She leaned into it. She went home.